Guten Abend, euch allen, und seid begrüßt zu die Kadimah. Und einen schönen Dank noch einmal zu unserer jiddische Diva Karen Feldman für ihre fantastische Musik. Good evening, everyone. I'm Faye Burston, the cultural producer of the Kadimah, Australia's home of Yiddish language and culture. Welcome to tonight's event, the third in this year's Matona series, our online winter lockdown sessions of Yiddishkeit Oifenekhan. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Kadimah stands today with a Yiddish acknowledgement of country. Wir anerkennen die traditionelle Opiter von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint, das Bunwarang-Volk von dem Kulin-Volk und wir geben auch Covid seine Eltern von Amol, von heint und von der Zukunft. We are thrilled to welcome tonight our very special guest, Christa Whitney, live from Northampton, Massachusetts in the United States, where it is currently 6 a.m. Some of us were lucky enough to meet the charming Christa in person when she visited Melbourne in 2017 to conduct video interviews with Yiddish speakers in her role as director of the Wexler Oral History Project at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Although it was only 4 years ago, heartbreakingly, quite a number of people she met and interviewed are no longer with us, including Teile Kadimah Mitglieder, such as longtime Kadimah board member and my uncle David Burston, and beloved passionate Yiddishistin Hannah Marocki and Floris Kalman. So we are indeed indebted to Christa for the memories she preserved, some of which we hope to see tonight. Originally from Northern California, Christa discovered Yiddish while studying comparative literature at Smith College. She has studied Yiddish language at the Vilnius Yiddish Institute, as well as the Yiddish Book Center, where she participated in the Steiner Summer Yiddish Program and was a graduate fellow. Christa will present her talk with video clips for about half an hour, and then we will open up to questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, and we'll get to them in order. Tara Freund, please welcome Christa Whitney.
Shalom Aleichem, a good Abend, a good Morgen bei mir. So good to be here. I'm really excited to sort of be back virtually in Melbourne. I've been spending some time the last few days traveling back there. And I'm really excited to share with you tonight just some reflections on that time. And looking forward to sharing some of the footage and voices that we documented together, and answering any questions at the end, of course. So I'll jump right in because I want to show as many videos as I can. It looks like I need something to be able to share my screen. There we go, perfect. Great, so I wanted to start off this the presentation with this question here about Yiddish Melbourne, Eckwelt, which I'm sure is a phrase that many of you are familiar with, the ends of the earth, which really clearly takes the point of view of Europe and Northern America, of placing Melbourne at the ends of the earth relation to us, or a global center of a Yiddish cultural future. And that's sort of the question that I am presenting here to frame my reflections, because I think that was sort of a transformation for me in before I had visited Melbourne and then after. So I thought I'd start first by just explaining what the project that I direct at the Yiddish Book Center is about. The Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project began many years ago now. It's hard to believe, but we recorded our first oral history in 2010. And since then, we've recorded over 1,000 in-depth video oral history interviews. And the goal is to document Yiddish language and culture really outside of the ultra-Orthodox world to date, through personal memories and narratives. it's a part of the Yiddish Book Center, which is a larger nonprofit organization, non-governmental organization that is working to recover, celebrate, and regenerate Yiddish and modern Jewish literature and culture. There are many other really interesting programs, as well as digital collections available at the Yiddish Book Center. So if you're into Yiddish, there's plenty, there's many hundreds of hours you can spend watching interesting and listening and reading interesting things on the Yiddish Book Center's website. So I invite you all over there. The Oral History Project has a presence on the Yiddish Book Center's website. I put the URL there, and we do have a bit of a backlog, but over 800 of the over 1,000 interviews are available on our website. And that is part of the intention that we really in oral history in general, but also in this project, that we think of ourselves as creating an archive that then can be referenced and drawn from for research, for creative work, for the future. So a little bit about February 2017, which feels simultaneously recent and a lifetime ago. So I came to Melbourne for about a month. I worked for 29 days, and did 29 oral histories in those days. Almost all of them were in Yiddish. That was one of the things we prioritized, is recording interviews taka af Yiddish, really in Yiddish. And this trip was a very close and important partnership with the Kadimah. So I want to thank especially Renata Singer, but many at the Kadimah for their help in organizing. We had many calls ahead of time organizing the lists of who we might want to interview, how to prioritize, and we knew we wouldn't get to everyone we wanted to. And then they were instrumental in helping to set up all of those interviews, and in the years since in helping to translate for the subtitles that you'll see in some of the clips tonight. So just to give you a little bit of context of why I went to Melbourne, the Yiddish Book Center began the Oral History Project based in Amherst, Massachusetts, and then quickly learned that, it's going on its own, quickly learned that that recording, interviews only in Amherst, Massachusetts was not going to be representative of the Yiddish world, Yiddish speaking world around. So we quickly started doing field work, again, with the goal of creating a collection that is representative of the Yiddish speaking diaspora. So we've recorded oral histories in many countries, 15 countries, I believe, is our current count, many states in the US. And whenever possible, we try to use this partnership model of working with a local organization or archive, because I would love, if possible, for our work to not feel like parachuting in and taking these stories out, but rather a partnership where the recordings are also have a home in the community and can be a benefit to the community as well. So I'm going to jump in whenever I am talking. I prefer to have other people use my space as a platform for other voices. So I want to jump in right away to showing you some clips. I thought I'd start tonight, this morning, tonight, whatever time is, with a bit of my personal perspective. I grew up in California, as Faye said, and studied in Eastern Massachusetts and as well as Europe. So I began my study of Jewish culture really from that perspective of the North American and European context. And so Melbourne really was a mythical Yiddish place. When I first heard about it was actually, I believe, in this interview that I'm about to show you with Jack Levin here. And I thought I'd just show this to you to give you a sense of sort of what was the first inkling I heard about this magical place.
1950 begon uitgebrochen in Korea. En ich habe gewollt sein, weg von Europa, wie war es möglich. Und ich habe gekickt auf der Mappe, habe ich gesehen, als Australien, speziell Melbourne, is on the bottom of the world. Das kennt ihr nicht kein Warte. Und als ich von meinen Geweihren sind ich gefühlt nach Melbourne. Damals habe ich gerade Gassen, wir haben Gassen gehabt in 47. Jahr. Ich habe sich verschrieben, in den 1950 bin ich gefahren nach Melbourne. Ich stelle vor mir, sind gewesen auf einem Migrantenschiff 33 Tage. 4 Männer in der Kabine. Aber man hat gesungen. Alt gewesen 23 Jahre, wenn er das geschafft.
Was für ein Kechile hat gefunden? Dort?
Oh, my kind of Kechile. Sie war wenig Jiden, aber es sind ungefähr konzentriert, mehr wenige, nicht weit. Du ist mit sich breit, Los Angeles ist breit. Sicher, es haben nicht gewollt, 700.000 Jiden, also wie du. Aber die, was haben gewohnt, sind nicht gewollt, weit eine voneinander. Und dort ich bin eine Institution, was hat geheißen Kadimah. Es existiert noch. So mehr, wenn 5 Jahre haben sie gefeiert, 100 Jahre Existenz. Sie war eine Kulturinstitut, eine National Library mit der Bibliothek. Und so haben wir ein Stück an Theater. Aber es ist bloß ältere Menschen. Bei mir haben sie ausgewählt, die 50 Jahre, weißt du. Meine jüngste Tochter ist etliche 50 Jahre. Und wenn wir sind gekommen, nicht stark organisierte Gruppe, eine Gruppe zusammen, von Brüssel, und mir gestellt keine Vorstellungen, weil Kleinkunst, Lieder, nicht gar groß. Die, was haben gewohnt, was hat geheißen, National Library, mit der Bibliothek der Menschen. Von Brüssel, und mir gestellt keine Vorstellungen, weil Kleinkunst, Lieder, nicht gar groß ist. Trotzdem haben sich einmal genommen, resikiert, gespielt, live, geskoilert. Aber in Brüssel, in Melbourne, haben wir reingetreten in dem Theater. In bald hat weiß jetzt gestellt, die 200.000 für Schulen. Ich habe bald gekriegt eine größere Rolle. Mottele.
So that was the first I had heard about this place, Melbourne, and it as a Yiddish center. And then, you know, I got curious. I started meeting a couple of people, other people who had been there. And, you know, of course, speaking with Renata, came up with this idea to do this field work. So I mean, I'm sure this is all known to you, but you know, I had to go in and get my bearings here, figure out a bit of history about Jews in Australia, and particularly Yiddish-speaking Jews. And then, you know, I hopped on a plane in February 2017 and flew to Melbourne, and within a few days began hearing firsthand about this special community. It seems that my slides are auto, like they're just going forward after a minute, so I'll see if I can get the video to play without interruption here. But I thought I'd start with us, really in the farthest back living memory that I found. The living memory that people had that I interviewed, which was, of course, the pre-war period. And so here we have the wonderful David and Ben Burstein, who are going to talk about their childhood in Carleton.
Wir haben es gewesen ein gedingte Haus in Lygon Street, 639 Lygon Street, North Carleton. Es gewesen eine Sache Jeden, aber nicht so viel jiddishistische Jeden wie in unserer Sprache. Das ist gekommen später. Und wir haben gehabt eine Sockenfabrik in the backyard. Oftmals is given Artikeln in the Presse gegen the terrible backyard factories exploiting the workers. Is given wir haben exploitiert the Urmel Light von Carleton. Ist gewesen so ein komisch, aber
die Geschäfte.
Ja, es ist gewesen ein paar jüdische Geschäfte in unserer Gegend. Ich schon gewesen, einer was hat verkauft Frucht und Vegetables. Es ist gewesen ein jüdisches Geschäft. Es ist gewesen ein Butcher.
Fleisch.
Fleisch. Es ist gewesen ein
Abteike.
Ein Abteig.
Und Geschäften.
Ja, gewesen ein klein grocery store. Als von jeden. Es gewesen von die Geschäften in unserer Gegend. Sind öfter Hälfte gewesen jüdische Geschäfte. Es war ein jüdischer Barber.
Aber was ich kann auch sagen, als das sind gewesen die Geschäfte, wo jeden, so wie man sagt, kaufen Sachen, aber jeden haben gemacht und gewesen ganz stark in Schier, Socken, Anzüge, Manteln und in der Textilindustrie sind die Jiden gewesen sehr stark und sie haben entwickelt die Textilindustrie in Australien. Die neue.
Zoom, you'd think I'd figure it out by now. So, oops. Yeah.
There was an active.
So that sort of sets the stage for thinking about sort of what existed, what were the institutions that were around, what was the structure of the Jewish community, and specifically the Yiddish institutions, or the institutions organized by Yiddish speakers in the pre-war period. And so I wanted to show here a clip from Arnold Zabel, describing a bit about that. So here we go.
Community, very active, you name it. There was a street, Drummond Street, where you had the Yiddish Parrot Show I attended. So on a Wednesday evening and on a Sunday morning, we studied Yiddish in a secular school. And then, within the same block, you had the Talmud Torah for those who wanted to send their kids to get a religious education. And then you had the Bialik school, which was for kids who, whose parents wanted them to learn Hebrew. And, they were the forerunners, right, of what became the day school movement. And then there was the Kadimah, which is where we're now sitting, but the Kadimah moved with the demographics. So it was founded in 1911 and was in the city And then by 1915 it had moved to Carlton, and finally in 1933 it moved into a building that the community had built. I call it a secular synagogue. You know, it's got these sort of arched windows, and these were factory workers, a lot of them, and they put together their money and they commissioned an architect, and they built this incredible place which also had a stage, a Yiddish stage, you know, a stage for Yiddish Theatre. In fact, when it was opened in 1933, they premiered Grina Felder, right, a play by Hirschbein, I think it was. And, you know, can you imagine coming in and the stage, the curtain opens and there's a pastoral scene from Poland. And for these guys that were coming in as first generation immigrants, it was extraordinary. And that became the home of Yiddish culture and Yiddish theatre for the next 35 years. It was in 1968 that they finally shifted to here, where they got bought the theatre, which is, these buildings where we are now. And interestingly enough, where we're sitting now, the library, in a way, the library has always been the heart of it, right? So if you ask me about my childhood, the library plays a role too. So you've got, it began as a library in 1911, you know, a place with English, Yiddish, Hebrew books, almost a multilingual library. And that was, it was like a travelling library, you know, with people of the book. So at the centre was a library. Packets Hirschbein came to Australia with his, you know, with his Esther Shumiach, I think she a Yiddish poetess, you know, a very romantic couple. He came here in I think she a Yiddish poetess, you know, a very romantic couple. He came here in 1921, I think it was, and he couldn't believe that there was this space at the ends of the earth. You know, we have an expression, Ekwelt. You know, Ekwelt, here we are, this small group, because it was still relatively small then, of Yiddish speakers who, you know, have a little stage as it was then back in 1921. So that stage, that building, you know, later on in the 50s became pretty much the center of my existence.
So here we have a dense Jewish neighborhood with business and community. We have a cultural center. We have a theater. There are these components that are very much established in the early 20th century, and then, you know, we move along to the war, and I think part of the sort of mythology and fact about the war from the perspective of Melbourne, and specifically Yiddish Melbourne, is this story about people who were coming from Europe, visiting Australia, and then got stuck. Fortuitously, it turned out. So here, let's hear from Haile Jacobs about this story.
Davon kommen wunderbare Gäste von der ganzen Welt. Koidem kol ist da gewesen ein interessanter Ort, wo Menschen kommen, von Vater Milchome Jahren früher, sie sind gelaufen von den Pogromen in Polen und in Davon kommen wunderbare Menschen kommen, von Vater Milchome Jahren früher, sie sind gelaufen von den Pogromen in Polen und in Russland, sind sie gelaufen über der Welt. Nicht alle können kommen in Amerika, aber sie sind kommen in Australien. Und Australier haben sich angeordnet und gemacht Fabriken und geworden ganz vermöglich. Also als Polen schicken, Menschen sind gekommen, verschiedene Menschen sammeln Geld da, und zwischen sie ist gekommen Janke Weißlitz, wenn man mit der Reisgeschichte von Polen, zu sammeln Geld in Europa und Australien für Yiddish Theater in Polen. Und ist verfahren in Australien und der Mohammed ist umgeräumt sich und geblieben stecken da. Dieselbe Sache gewesen mit Rochel Holzer, dieselbe Sache gewesen mit der sachidische Schreiber, wo sind gefahren zufällig und geblieben stecken in Australien, weil der Mohammed sich umgeräumt. ist Australien, speziell Melbourne, gewesen maseldick. Also in einer verworfenen Winkel wie in Australien, und mir gehabt als solche wunderbare Akteuren wie Rochelholzer und Weißlitz. Das haben gewesen bekannt und bewusst im Poem für Adam Ochom.
So I do want to apologize for the volume level on these videos. I don't know what it is. Something about the PowerPoint is making them play very softly, but I will let you know you can watch them all later on our website if you want to hear the voice stronger. I do have it at maximum volume. Apologies. So then sort of moving along through the 20th century, you know, we have a population surge of refugees from Europe who arrive after the war. You know, one of the things I learned was in my time there was sort of, why did this happen? And I discovered that, you know, really horrifyingly, that that many countries you know, weren't letting refugees in, which I sort of knew, but I didn't realize that Australia actually had more lenient visa restrictions than many other countries. And this fact of it being the country that accepted more Jewish refugees than any other country after Israel really jumped out at me. And this influx of Holocaust survivors gave you know, and I heard this from the people I spoke with, you know, that either the immigrants themselves talking about, well, there were these institutions here, or from the perspective of those who were already had grown up in Australia, talking about how the refugees sort of gave a new audience, a new energy. But there was something there that they were building on, and I think that's an important aspect of the story of Yiddish Melbourne. So I want to just give you one story here about arriving in Melbourne that I really enjoyed. So here we have one of those.
Was ist dein erster Eindruck von Melbourne?
Der Eindruck sehr gut. Ich bin gekommen zum Zug. Bin ich gewesen, ich habe weiter mal rausgenommen, ich gewesen ein Bild von Peters Eiscreme. Ich habe gerade 5 Schilling, ich habe gerade ausgetauscht, 500. Bin ich reingegangen in der Milchbar, ich habe gewesen auf dem Bild, Peters Eiscreme, also sie geben aber an Eiscreme. Aber ich gehe 5 Schilling. Zahlt der Ruck, ich gehe mir zurück und gehe jeden an Eiscreme. Eiscreme gewesen 5 Pennies. Peters Eiscreme gewesen. Ach, wunderbar. Von Frankreich in die Kamille. Sehr guten Eindruck. Bis hart. Kein Mensch bedauert.
Was ist dein erster Eindruck?
Well, I want to pause here to sort of to zoom out a little bit. So I have done field work in and recorded oral histories in many different countries, as I mentioned at the top. And I've noticed over the years, you know, that there is a structure. There are structures and institutions that exist in many of these secular Yiddish speaking communities. And so I thought I'd just write them out here because I think it's interesting to think about what similarities there are in the Yiddish speaking diaspora, and then what particularities, of course, in each community. So here, you know, these are some of the sort of, I think of them as the pillars or the structures of a secular Yiddish speaking community. Schools, having the existence of a cultural center. You know, of course, in any community, you're going to have people talking about where they grew up, but the fact of having neighborhoods with more densely populated with Yiddish speakers or Jews to sort of bring people together in daily life and interaction and using the language. And then activists, people who care about Yiddish and want, have the koyach, have the excitement to further Yiddish and to make Yiddish an important part of cultural life. Of course, having some kind of critical mass, although I would say even in communities where there are very few Yiddish speakers, I still do see these, I have seen these institutions. A library, a theater, a chorus is often part of the group structure, radio programs, other cultural structures, of course, producers also of Yiddish culture, being writers or editors, and then the platform publications, and certainly more recently, especially when we got into the later 20th century and into the 21st century, I think the existence of academic programs for Yiddish really do feed into the community in sort of a cyclical way. Sometimes the academic program has contact with the cultural center or vice versa. So these are just some, these are some thoughts that have been percolating, and I think it's sort of interesting to think about big picture. And even I know that that some of these structures were actually dictated by international organizations. I remember learning when I traveled to Brazil, where communism was quite strong, that there would be actually central committees who said, these are the institutions that you should set up in your community. And so it's interesting to think about which of these are, grassroots, which of these are sort of imported from either a political organization or just a sense of, maybe from Eastern Europe, but these are the institutions that are central to a community. So certainly Melbourne has all of these, has had and continues to have many of these, as we'll talk about. So I thought I'd take us through some stories about, and a bit of history about about a couple of these that I think really are the reason why Yiddish Melbourne is what it is. So here we have again Chayla Jacobs back to talk about her mother's involvement in the Yiddish schools.
My Mama, also wie sie noch kennt, ist sie bald weg, sie gibt eine Schule, was hat geheißen, der Peretschule, eine Sonntagsschule, bloß eine Sonntagsschule. Also wie sie noch gehört, dass es auch auf dem Schiff ist, man bald gekommen zu ihr, als Bewilia dort. Und sie dann gibt es arbeiten Sonntag, eine ganze Woche hat sie gearbeitet in der Fabrik und Sonntag versteht sich gearbeitet in der Schule. Und das ist angegangen ein paar Jahre, bis wann die Emigration unserer da, die Menschen haben sich eingeordnet und sich geworden mehr vermöglich, haben sie angegeben, wegzufahren von Kalten, rübergefahren, die Jara, unser Wasser, in der andere, nennt er zum Jam, wo sie geben schönere Häuser, bequemere, und mit gefühlt, als bedarf haben in der Seite von der Jara, euch etwas Jiddisch, eine jiddische Schule. Hat mir neu umgeben zu trachten wegen dem, und Tage Giligitsch, das gehört wegen dem. Ja? Es gibt der Raumführer von der jiddischen Schule in Kalten, und mit dem ganzen Komitee haben beschlossen, aber darf öffnen eine jiddische Schule in der Seite von Melbourne. Ist auch noch eben am besten, sonst so eben mit der Kindergarten. Die Mama gewinnt spezialisiert im Kindergarten. Ist Jascha Scher genommen ein Auto, er hat schon dann gefahren mit einem Auto, und genommene Mammen und sind weggefahren in eine Hurtovdie, wo man verkauft Zatzkes für Kinder, ungekauft ein Fuhrenauto. Der Komitee hat geschaffen ein Haus mit geöffneter Kindergarten. Und von dem Kindergarten hat ausgewachsen 2 Kindergärten. Es sind in 2 Jahren, 3 Jahre geworden 2. Es ist geworden mit der Gegenüber zu spreiten. Und Saison geben sich eine Sonntagsschule. Und von der Sonntagsschule ist geworden eine Talkschule und ist daraus der ganze Charakter, eine ganze Scholmalechem-Schule. Aber angeheben hat sich es von dem ersten Kindergarten, wo es die Mama hat gekauft, die Spielzeug für die Kinder.
I think, of course, you know, in order to have a Jewish school system that involves Yiddish, you have to have, again, that critical mass of people that will send their children there, and Yiddish-speaking families, or, you know, families that are interested in an education that involves Yiddish. So that's sort of, you know, the activist and then the community, that, again, that interplay. And a very special, I think, development in the Melbourne cultural scene is the development of radio. And this is something that to me was interesting, because in many other places I've traveled, you know, radio is really something in the early 20th century. Certainly nowadays we have some Yiddish podcasts, but in my mind, you know, Yiddish radio was more in the first half of the 20th century. Certainly in New York City, it existed later on, but really the heyday was earlier. And this story in Melbourne is different, that really the development and expansion of radio programs in Yiddish came after the war, tied to some political you know, interest in multiculturalism in the country, as I understand it. So here is the wonderful Danielle talking about it.
Wir haben gerade Programme, Sonntag und Freitag. Jetzt sind sie schon nicht da. Alex hat 10 Minuten, 12 Minuten, Freitag, Sonntag in der Früh, das ist es. Wir haben gehabt Montag, ich gewinne ein Jugendprogramm. Ein Abend Mittwoch habe ich gehabt eine halbe Show, was ich habe ausgenutzt so. Freitag haben wir gehabt eine Show und Sonntag eine Show. Und wir haben gehabt wirklich, und alles gewinnt auf Jiddisch. Alles gewinnt auf Jiddisch. Äußer, wir haben da gehabt Jan Karski. Aber ich habe mir aufgebracht, und ich habe mir der Reinführer gewinnt auf Jiddisch. Hat gerät auf Englisch verständlich. Aber es ist gewinnt verbunden, verständlich mit Geschehnissen, was gewinnt interessant für den misrach-europäischen Eulam und jiddisch-redenden Eulam. Ich treffe sich doch mit Menschen, die sagen, sie pflegen sich zuhören jede Woche zu den jiddischen Programmen, zu den jiddischen Auditions. Yeah. Und wir haben gehabt wunderbare, ich bin geworden, die Anführung von dem Radio. Ich gewinne, auf dem Radio, ich gewinne Pinier, ich gewinne der Erste. Hat mich hereingezogen in Radio. Gewinnt äußergewöhnlich in Gefinnen Keuches. Und hat mich hereingezogen in Radio. Und sie gewinnt Jascha Scher hat Anteil genommen. Und seine Programme sind alle gewinnt wunderbar. Avron Zickert, wo sie gewinnt auch ein Stück Poet. Aber seine Programme sind gewinnt sehr intelligent und interessant. Und alles so prächtigen Jiddisch. Und wir haben gehabt wir pflegen haben Korrespondenten von Ausland. Ich pflege rekordieren Avrom Verses von Jerusalem, was gewinnt ausgezeichnet, euch a Wilner. Und sein Bruder gewinnt Professor von Literatur durch sich auf der Hebräischen Universität. Und wir pflegen ihm rekordieren jede Woche, und hat ständig gehabt interessante Sachen zu erzählen. Sie gewinnen wunderbare Jahre in Radio.
So from radio to the stage, we heard earlier on that that, you know, Yiddish theater existed as soon as, and probably before, you know, Kadimah had a stage. And I couldn't choose a clip because there were, theater was one of, there are many different clips about Yiddish theater. So I wanted, and I'm also short on time, so I wanted to just point you all to this wonderful book that Arnold Zabel put together, a beautiful bilingual book about the David Herman Theater. Of course, but there were also other theater and are other theater groups, of course, in Melbourne. And I think, again, this is one of the institutions that I see over and over in communities that have substantial Yiddish culture. The existence of the theater brings in people, even who may not be speaking Yiddish in their daily lives, but they can learn their lines in Yiddish. And as we up here in North America have seen, it's also a way to, along with music, I think one of the ways that the broader culture of non-Yiddish speaking Jews and non-Jews interact with Yiddish culture. As we saw recently with the Yiddish version of Fiddler auf dem Dach or Fiddler on the Roof, which I hope will come to you. I know that that tour was interrupted, but that is an opportunity again to bring in a wider audience. And I can't really talk about Melbourne and Yiddish without mentioning the Bund, which I haven't yet. So I thought I'd show this is bringing in someone who's not from Melbourne, but she has a really Irina Klepvich, a wonderful poet, has a really lovely, I think, description of the Jewish Labor Bund. So I wanted to just bring that in here and then talk a little bit about its existence in Melbourne.
How would I describe the Jewish Labor Bund began as a kind of socialist movement aimed at Jewish workers, and evolved into, very quickly actually, evolved into a kind of socialist, and evolved into, very quickly actually, evolved into a kind of socialist, self-consciously, culturally identified movement, so that they weren't just, that wasn't only interested or understood that just either having better wages or better working conditions was really not enough, and that that people needed schools and libraries and sports organizations and theater and art and literature in order to lead a kind of enriched life. So it's not a typical kind of just socialist, kind of union organizing movement, to the way I perceive it.
So I know that didn't have subtitles, so just to pull out in case anyone couldn't understand that. What I like about her characterization and description of the Bund is that it wasn't only a political organization, or part of the politics was to be, as she says, self-consciously culturally identified. And I think that is something that I've seen really in getting curious and learning about the history of the Bund, is this marriage of, or sort of, and sometimes tension between political organizing and a focus on building cultural institutions. This notion that better wages and better working conditions isn't enough, that you also need to have libraries and theaters and schools and those cultural institutions. So I wanted to bring that in, and then bring in a perspective of a Melbourner about this, because, I think it's from my perspective, it does it is an important characteristic of Yiddish culture to this day in Melbourne. So here we have Judy Ringelblum.
Doigkeit meint, als das jiddische Leben ist nicht verbunden mit wo man lebt, nur wie man lebt, was man tut. Das heißt, es ist nicht stamm, ich wohne in Melbourne, ich rufe sich ein Bundist, ich bin ein Jid und das ist genug. Verkehrt. Das ist vielleicht noch nicht der Anheib. Der Anheib ist, was heißt es zu sein ein Jid da in Melbourne und was tust du zu dem? Es ist mein Zugang, meine persönliche Philosophie zu Doigkeit, zu dem, es ist ein Spektrum von Assimilation. Von die, was sind in Ganzen verbunden mit der Jiddischkeit auf einem tagtäglichen, minutigen Leben, zu die, was sind jeden einmal ein Jahr, dreimal ein Jahr, einmal zu der Bar Mitzvah und gar nicht mehr, oder seine Levei ist das jiddischste Sache, was haben aufgetan mit seinem Leben. Aber ob es ist das Spektrum zur Assimilation, ist das Spektrum weg von Assimilation. Und jeder kann sich ausgläuben, wo sie wollen sein. Es ist nicht berechtigt zu sagen, ich bin ein Jid und gar nicht han. Es ist nicht berechtigt zu sagen, ich bin Punkt also jiddischlach. Man kann sagen, ich bin Punkt also ein Jid, wie jeder einer. Aber es ist nicht berechtigt zu sagen, ich bin Punkt also jiddischlach, wie der früher was daven dreimal am Tag und lernt sich tagtäglich. Es ist berechtigt zu sagen, ich kann sein Punkt also jiddischlach wie ob ich beweise, mit Leinen der jiddischen Literatur dreimal am Tag, mit sich ausreden auf der jiddischen Sprache tagtäglich, mit anfüllen mein Stub mit jiddischer Kunst und jiddischer Sprache und jiddische Aktivitäten, ob man lebt sich aus laut der jiddischer Zeit, ob die Yom Tovim sind dir wichtig, ob Shabbos ist dir wichtig. Und Shabbos muss nicht aufgehen sein durch einen Schiel, aber was tut ihr Shabbos zu beweisen, als Shabbos ist anders von der Rest von der Woche? Ein Havdalah muss nicht aufgehen sein mit der Tfille, aber es muss sein ein Unterschied von Shabbos und der Woche. Ist mit dem kann man sich ausleben jiddischlach. Und das bei mir, das ist, was von mir meint Doigkeit. Das Wissen, als man ist ein Jid, und es beweisen, keinem Kol sich, die Mischpoche, die Kehille der Welt. Ja, Dennis Prager, was ist nicht kein Bundist und nicht kein Jiddisch ist, aber er hat einmal gesagt, sag mir nicht, wie Jiddisch du bist, weiß mir. Und ich meine, er sagt, ja, wenn ich gehe dich noch einen Tag lang, wie will ich wissen, dass du bist ein Jid? Ich meine, das hat nichts zu tun, nicht mit der Frömmigkeit, nicht mit dem
Sorry, we cut off the last word there, but basically, I wanted to show that because I sort of, well, I'm a fan of Judy's and his beautiful Yiddish-speaking family, but also I think he's sort of throwing down the gauntlet there in terms of challenging not only Jews, but I think all of us to think about what are our imagined values, and then how do we live them out in our daily life. And so I think what I wanted to say about the Bund in Melbourne is just that these, again, the existence of institutions and structures is not the only thing. There is spontaneous and spontaneous culture and household and familial culture and community as well. But I think when from my perspective, looking at which communities of Yiddish speakers are more successful in maintaining a presence of Yiddish culture, it tends to be the ones that have at least some of these structures. So sort of this is the status of Jews in Australia. I pulled from a slide I was showing to Americans to give them some sense of the community there. And then I'll end with sort of, as I pause sort of midway through talking about what are the structures that in which and the aspects of Yiddish in Australia and Yiddish in Melbourne today. You know, you all have the Kadimah, you have activists, certainly. There's the library. I know there are Yiddish conversation groups and public events, theater and music as the pandemic allows. And so I'll just end with this question of sort of what is the future of Yiddish in Melbourne and in Australia in general. I mean, we are writing the history, you all are writing the history now. So I'll end there and happily take some questions.
Shalom Dank, Christa. That was a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions here for you. The first one is, what similarities and differences did you notice between Melbourne and other Yiddish centres that you visited?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the biggest, you know, difference that I notice right away is the context, the country, and sort of the landscape. I'm very interested in landscape. So I when I land in a place, I first am sort of taking stock of where are we? But certainly, as I was saying, that there are similarities in the institutions that tend to exist in Yiddish-speaking communities. So the existence of a library. I work at the Yiddish Book Center, so I'm very sensitive to where are the Yiddish books in a community, and are people caring for them? Are people reading them? Yiddish reading groups and conversation groups. Also just fascinating to me that many communities tend to, as soon as they arrive, set up theaters and set up artistic communities. So that's something I've certainly noticed, you know, in Brazil and Mexico and you know, Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Great. We've got a question from Alex saying, are there communities you're planning to record in future, given the chance?
Yeah,
Alex, definitely.
Certainly I have a list of, a wish list of places I'd love to go. You know, I think at this stage, having collected over 1,000 interviews, we're really taking stock of what are the gaps in the collection. And, you know, if we want to be, of course, it's never going to be complete, but if we want to have a somewhat representative collection, where do we need to collect? So certainly South Africa is a community that warrants more collecting on our part. And actually, interestingly, Western Europe, I for years thought that there must be someone doing this type of work in Western Europe, but that's something that we've begun to work on. My most recent fieldwork was in both Eastern Europe and Lithuania and England.
Great. Okay. Moishla. Hi, Moishla. Coming from America, it's early in the morning for you too. Moishla asks, did many of your interviews comment about the influence of skiff in their lives?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, talking about the Bund and its influence, I think certainly school and youth groups are integral to passing along a love of Yiddish, as I've observed. And I think skiff is yeah, people definitely talked about it, and those, you know, there's a division among people in youth groups and camps. Some people love them, some people are not into it, but people who love skiff really loved skiff.
Great. Lerin Hinder has a question for you. Melbourne is unique in having a Yiddish day school, Shalom Aleichem College. Can you share your observations of the school?
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have hi Hinda, a huge opportunity to visit the school too much, but I think that is something that is certainly very special about Melbourne. I don't know, I mean, there are, you know, I spent time in Mexico where just a couple of years after they had taken Yiddish out of their Jewish day school, and I think that certainly was a sadness in the community. And I think the fact that Melbourne has Yiddish in the day school and has opportunities for children to learn Yiddish again instills that both the language and appreciation for the culture at a younger age. So definitely a very important part of the community from my perspective.
Yaffa Goldschmidt has a question. How did you become interested in doing this?
Yeah, so I'm not Jewish. I didn't grow up really even knowing what Yiddish was. I discovered Yiddish in university. I went to university, which was just down the road from the Yiddish Book Center here, and I had a professor who happened to be I was studying comparative literature and dance actually, and my professor in comparative literature happened to be an expert in the Jung Vilna literary group. So he included a lot of Yiddish in his courses, and I just got verhabt, you know, I got really taken with particular writers and began learning Yiddish first at the Yiddish Book Center and then in Vilna at the Yiddish Institute there when it existed.
Great. Tom Tenenbaum has a question about whether you see similarities between Melbourne and Antwerp.
Oh, good question. Antwerp is somewhere that I've never been. I've only read about. So I can't really speak on that yet.
Okay. How do you decide who to interview?
Yeah, it's hard. There are always more people to interview than we're able to. So in this case, well, in general, we try to think about what are the topics that we want, what are the aspects of culture and history that we want to record, who are the people who can speak to them, and then also prioritize geography and of course age. Try to prioritize native Yiddish speakers whenever possible to record as well, to have that linguistic bonus of capturing, documenting native Yiddish and different dialects. But it's ever evolving, and there are always more than we wanted to. I will mention in the case of Melbourne that we worked with the Kadimah to develop a list. You know, we knew that I only had a month to be here, and we weren't able to get to everyone we wanted to, but I'm excited that we are actually continuing to do a few interviews over Zoom now, as to try to sort of fill out some of those voices that we missed when I was there in person.
Tanya Black asks whether you're aware of the renaissance of Yiddish conversation groups here. Some are structured and many are just ad hoc, and there's a real thirst for reconnecting with the language for many of their childhood. Yeah,
I think that is wonderful. I don't know too much about that, but I do know that really, as I understand it, really all over the world, wherever there are Yiddish speakers, I mean, I often travel not only to do fieldwork, but say to go to conferences, and everywhere I go, I try to see, is there a Yiddish group? And often there will be a small, you know, even when I went to Oklahoma City, you know, there was a small Yiddish speakers who found each other and wanted to practice. So I think that is something very special about Yiddish, that it brings people together.
It does. It's a great connector. Now, what is this we hear about a documentary that you're making?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah. So last year we released it hasn't been released to the public yet, but a film called Wer wird bleiben, Who Will Remain, about the Yiddish writer Avram Sitzkever and his family, his granddaughter who's an Israeli actress, and she goes back to Vilna with her family to trace the places that he lived and try to sort of make sense of the Holocaust and his legacy after he's died. So that is the film, and I'm hoping it will come to your shores soon. It's been very strange to be pushing out a film during the pandemic, but I hope it will get to you soon.
We can't wait to see it. And I think that brings us to the end of our questions. If there's any more questions, please put them in. Karen Feldman says, Dank, and as we all do. Christa, it's been such a pleasure having you online. Thank you for getting up so early in the morning. And
thank you so much for having me.
Bleib gesund, and we hope to see you again soon. We hope to see your film soon.
Yes, okay, bleib alle gesund und stark. It's great to see you.
Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
Mazel, es scheint einmal für jeden, no nicht für mir. Wenn es kommt an die Nacht, bleib ich sitzen und tracht, noch ein Tag ist schon